One of my favorite things about indie games is that you get to see a much wider variety of game developers. Historically, a lot of the major game studios were from either Japan or America, and while Europe in particular has its own development history, when it comes to classic horror games, a lot of the most influential games came from these two regions. Early horror games see you exploring old rundown shrines filled with yokai and ghosts, or an American city overrun by monsters. And while I love these settings and the things they offer, I'd much rather see something a little bit different. Nowadays, with horror developers all over the world, a lot more places are getting recognition. Today, we're talking about 2021's Chasing Static by Headwear Games, a psychological horror game set in the Welsh countryside. The game begins with our protagonist Chris visiting a hospital where his father had recently passed. The nurse tells him that he only had one possession, a leather notebook. Chris explains that he never really got on with his father, but doesn't elaborate as to why. Afterwards, he decides to visit his childhood village, but along the way, a storm begins raging outside his car window. He decides to pull into a small roadside cafe called The Last Stop for a break, and inside, he meets a woman named Anira. She tells him he's missed his turn, but if he's willing to give her a lift, she can direct him back. After a bit more chatting, the power goes out and Anira asks Chris to have a look at the fuse box. With a bit of searching, he eventually finds enough working fuses to get the power back on, but when he returns to the cafe, he sees something horrifying. When he wakes up again, he finds himself lying on the floor. The cafe is in an awful state, and strange machinery lies on the tables. A phone ringing on the wall is what woke him up, and a voice on the other end tells him to stay out of the woods. This is the first 10 minutes of Chasing Static, a game that I have very mixed feelings on. There's a lot going on in the opening, but it sets up what's to come. Firstly, and this is something that stays through the entire 2-hour runtime, the game looks fantastic. I know I talk a lot about PSX graphics on this channel, but this game really does look phenomenal. Just look at the way the rain hits the window of the car, or the sky hanging over the lake. It does an amazing job of setting the tone, alongside just looking incredible. The second thing you'll notice is the game's inspirations. From the opening, you might think that Silent Hill is the vibe we're going for, and you wouldn't be entirely incorrect. A 30-something male with a strange past returning to a town he has a connection with, but when he gets there, it transforms into a creepy place he can't leave with monsters roaming around. That's about as Silent Hill as you can get, but the more you play, the more you realize the game's biggest inspiration is an 80s sci-fi horror. Chris finds bodies littering the idyllic lakeside wearing yellow hazmat suits. He eventually discovers a bunker filled with maps and old computer terminals, and documents about radio frequencies are scattered across the game world. My biggest compliment about Chasing Static is how it sets up its tone and manages to keep it for the majority of the game's runtime. The town of Hearth is home to some mysterious phenomenon, and whatever company had been investigating it until recently has made a grave mistake. Once Chris reaches the bunker, he hears the voice of Helen come through one of the communication devices, and we finally get some answers. Whatever the phenomenon is, it seems to be connected to radio signals, and the researchers in the station had developed a device that could trap them within the village. For some reason, all 3 of the machines that keep them trapped were switched off at the same time, which forced the station into lockdown. Since she's trapped in the main facility, Helen asks Chris to venture out to the 3 sites and reactivate the machines so that they can both escape. Confused, but with no other choice, Chris picks up a machine on the desk and begins his journey to stop whatever creature inhabits the town from spreading further. This is where we reach our primary mechanic and the game begins to open up. The displacement device is the main gimmick. It works kind of like a compass, except when you point it in the right direction, it picks up radio signals. Once you get close enough to the signal, you'll be treated to a flashback. Some are of the researchers after the facility lost power, others are of regular civilians spending time near the lake, and while some of them exist for story reasons, others tell you where important key items are. So now you have your gameplay loop. Find a frequency, unlock a key item, find your way to a new area, activate the device, and repeat. As Chris explores these important locations, you start to learn more about exactly what happened here. For example, the farm across the lake, which is referred to as Ground Zero, has a massive crater in the center, as if something had crash landed there long ago. Or the village itself. where you see remnants of police barricades and hear flashbacks of civilians begging to be let go. A lot of these story elements are hinted at in the flashbacks, but mostly told through the environment itself. Also a very small thing, but if you manage to miss an important item in an area and then come back, big text appears telling you that you missed something, which is fantastic. I really wish more games adopted this as an idea to save me running around areas repeatedly looking for the one key I missed. Probably the most interesting area in the game is the village, a quaint little street that you could easily picture in the real world. It's very rare that I get to see a legally distinct version of a shop I see every day in a video game. I'm used to it always being some American or Japanese store, so it was fun for a change. The main focus of the village is an old pub, and this is probably my favourite location in the game. While other places like the cafe or the farm have clear signs of the organisation being there, they seem as though they've been abandoned for a long time. Hearth, on the other hand, shows clear signs of panic. Ambulances and police cars with their sirens still on, boarded up windows and police tape, barricades with shadowy figures peering from the other side. It really feels like a quiet little village that was one day visited by something so horrific that it was left in a hurry and sealed away. So the game has an interesting premise and the vibes seem to be perfect. Why am I so conflicted on it? Before we get into any negatives, I want to highlight that this game was created entirely by one man, Nathan Hamley. When it comes to talking about indie games, there's always a bit of a conflict. In my opinion, you can't compare a game made by one man and a dream to a huge team with a proper studio budget, even if indie games have proven to be better than most of the AAA space a lot of the time. However, I also don't want to infantilize indie developers. No one likes patting them on the head and going, "Wow, you made this all by yourself?" However, I do think it's important to point out that games like Chasing Static have a much harder time making it into the world, so I tend to give them a little more leeway in certain regards. Chasing Static, despite its development story, doesn't fall into the problems I have with other indie games. Typically an indie game fails not because of its ideas, but because it feels like it doesn't have the money or talent to fully implement them. Chasing Static is a beautiful game that nails its audio-based horror ideas, but fails to keep that quality for a lot of its other aspects. The game is described as a psychological horror, which means that Chris spends most of the game completely defenseless. There is an exception to this, but we'll talk about that later. Most of the game's scares come from people appearing behind grates, or the audio building up tension, but there are also a few enemies in the game. In each major location, you might see a weird form in the distance, moving strangely and causing your machine to react. If you're spotted, they'll shamble towards you, which your horror game experience will tell you is a very bad thing. In the beginning, these apparitions actually were quite scary. They're almost invisible, so a lot of the time you don't even realize how close they are until they're nearly on top of you. But then, you might not be paying attention, or you just couldn't get away fast enough, and they'll catch you, which reveals nothing. The ghosts can't hurt you, nor does there seem to be any penalty for touching them. They exist entirely to creep you out, but once they catch you, all of the tension they've built disappears entirely. Enemies in horror games are an extremely fine balance, one that really deserves an entire video. If they exist purely as obstacles, they become more annoying than fun, and if they're too easy to deal with, then they don't feel threatening. Psychological horror games in particular have to walk this tightrope between annoying and scary very well, or else you risk losing the fear factor. My problem with Chasing Static is that once I realized the enemies weren't a threat, the game just stopped being overly scary. Sure, it had creepy moments, but the first creature we saw and all the bloody corpses set up this unstoppable, horrifying monster that we just never see. I'll be the first to admit that this may come down to my own expectations going into the game. I picked it up based solely on seeing the developer on Twitter, and I wanted to go in as blind as possible. Had I known the game was closer to a Dear Esther than an Amnesia, I think I would have come out with only a few nitpicks. Funnily enough, the Steam description calls it a psychological horror short story, which perfectly sums up the game. You're wandering around this village listening to dialogue, learning about what happened and solving basic puzzles, and for some people that's perfect. I too enjoy games like this on the regular. However, and this is where my issues really come in, the gameplay isn't my major gripe with the game. I'm going to talk spoilers for a bit, so if you want to play the game as fresh as possible, I recommend skipping to this timestamp. So the story starts off pretty clear. Chris's father is dead, and his notebook mentions working as part of some shadowy corporation. Chris has an estranged relationship with his father, but feels drawn back to his childhood village. At this point, I think it's pretty obvious that Chris's father was at some point a part of the investigation in Hearth, and more than likely, Chris has some connection to it. When you reactivate the 3 relays and unlock the main facility, Chris enters to find Helen, who claims that she can finally put an end to what's happening here, but needs his help. You find a few more documents and explore the facility. You see strange nurseries and find bodies that have been experimented on. It's clear at this point that whatever research was happening here was questionable. Finally, you make it to a control room with a strange machine. Helen asks you to get into the chair, and despite Chris's reluctance, he eventually does. Up until this point, I actually liked the story. I liked that it was relatively ambiguous, although it was pretty obvious what was going on. Then we get the ending sequence. What follows is a near 10-minute exposition dump where everything you've assumed up until this point is spelled out for you. After his wife Anira's death, Chris's father became obsessed with unlocking the secrets of a meteor which landed on the farm, and began experimenting on his own child to try and develop a way of speaking to her from beyond the grave. Helen, the woman who has been guiding you since the bunker, was a researcher who helped Chris escape and sent him away to a foster family. Once Chris discovers the truth, he wakes up in the chair to find that the facility is empty. He leaves the village, finally having moved past the events that traumatized him, and returns to a normal life. I really hate this ending. It feels like in playtesting, players found it too hard to follow the story, so in the end they just decided to slap on a crazy amount of unnecessary exposition that completely undermines the player's intelligence. I'm not saying that's exactly what happened, but that's what it feels like. By the time you reach the control room, it's obvious that Chris was experimented on as a child, and that his repressed memories brought him back to the town after reading his father's journal. And if you had a short segment where you hear some dialogue by his father, and then cut to him waking up with Helen gone and the facility empty, it would have been a much better ending. You could have kept Chris's emotional dialogue, have him wrestle with what he's learned, and choose to move on. Instead, half of his dialogue feels like it exists for pure exposition. This is where the issue of genre comes in. If your horror game is going to be low on gameplay and rely mostly on creepy vibes and a good story, then your payoff has to be really good. Unfortunately, while I loved the early and mid-game, I feel like the whole facility section is a bit of a misstep. The idea of following sounds and focusing on lo-fi audio horror is already amazing. You spent so long only getting small snippets of dialogue and environmental storytelling that the tone and story is perfectly set up already. But then, all of that is thrown out the window in the last 15 minutes. It makes the whole thing feel limp. There's also so many unanswered questions and unused ideas. Who is the person that tells Chris not to go into the woods at the beginning? What was the creature that attacked Anira? Once we find out that the woman in the cafe represents his mother, you can argue that the creature is just a part of his delusion. But even still, why does nothing even coming close to this happen at any other point in the game when it's such an effective and creepy moment? If you're telling me that the same ghosts who barely react when they catch you in the game are the same ones responsible for what happens in the cafe, then why are they not more of a threat? This is without even getting into the game's true ending. In the farm area, you find a flashback about 2 researchers, one of which is going out with some new weapon the group developed. If you explore the edges of the area, you find a sonic weapon with a limited amount of ammo. Remember how I said the enemies don't do anything? Well, that's because they exist for this exact mechanic. If you manage to find all 3 ghosts and shoot them with your blaster, a terminal in the final area becomes accessible, which gives you some creepy footage. However, this has 0 impact on the ending. It continues as normal right up until the end credits, where you get a few seconds shot of a bunker in snow. That's it. It's just sequel bait. There is another ending, but it exists entirely as an homage to Resident Evil, so it's not important. Although I will say it is appreciated. Chasing Static is a perfect example of a game with great mechanics and ideas that I feel fumbles the bag near the end. Mechanically, it's sound, the game looks beautiful, and I would actually love to see if a sequel could develop these ideas further, but I'm left feeling like the game was missing something. I loved wandering the countryside and following the flashbacks to see what happened to the different groups, and if the whole game had felt like the first hour, it would have been amazing, but it just doesn't manage to maintain it. It's such a shame because the idea of an audio-based horror game set in a Welsh village is so unique. I hate feeling so excited about a game, only to find out that it just can't quite stick the landing. I'll be keeping an eye on what Nathan makes next. He seems to be working on a survival horror game at the minute, so I'm really hoping he manages to take all this talent and make something really special. Ultimately, do I recommend Chasing Static? If you're someone who wants to see a unique horror game with some interesting mechanics, great atmosphere, and a unique setting, then I'd definitely give it a look. If you're someone who wants more mystery and sneaking around enemies from your horror, I'm sorry to say, but this game probably isn't for you. Thanks for watching. This is my first video back after being away for a few weeks, so I hope you enjoyed it. If you've played Chasing Static, let me know if you think I'm being a bit harsh on it, or if you agree with me. As always, my socials and coffee are in the description, and if you want to see more videos like this, then please subscribe. I have tons of videos on the way. Thanks again, and I'll see you real soon.